Rain hammered against the iron gates of Ashcombe Manor as Clara Whitfield gripped the handle of her worn suitcase and knocked on the great oak door for the third time. Her knuckles ached, her clothes were soaked through, and the cold had settled deep into her bones. She had traveled 2 days by coach and on foot to reach this place, and now, standing on the threshold of the last hope she had left, she was terrified the door would never open. It finally did. A tall man stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes taking in her drenched appearance with obvious distaste. His dark hair was pushed back from his face, and his jaw was set in a hard line that suggested he had little patience for uninvited guests. This was Sebastian Ashcombe, the newly titled Duke of Ashcombe, though nothing about his cold expression matched the warmth people once spoke of when describing his family. "Whoever you are," he said, his voice low and clipped, "you have the wrong house." "Please," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. "I have a letter. From your late aunt, Lady Margaret. She said if I was ever in trouble, I could come here." Sebastian's eyes narrowed at the mention of his aunt, a woman he had loved deeply and lost only months earlier. He took the letter from Clara's shaking hand, unfolded it, and read the few lines written in his aunt's familiar hand. His expression did not soften. "My aunt is dead," he said flatly, "and so, apparently, is her judgment of character. She trusted many people who did not deserve it." "I am not asking for charity," Clara said quickly, before he could close the door. "I only need a place to stay. 1 month. I will work for my keep. I will scrub floors, mend linens, tend the garden, anything you need. Just 1 month, and then I will leave, and you will never see me again." Sebastian studied her for a long moment. Rain dripped from her chin. Her shoes were falling apart at the seams, and yet there was something in her eyes, some quiet steel beneath the desperation, that made him pause instead of shutting the door in her face as he had planned. He let out a short, humorless laugh. 1 month, he repeated, as though the words themselves were absurd. "You stand here soaked to the bone, begging a stranger for shelter, and you think 1 month will be enough to convince me you are worth the trouble. I don't expect you to believe me," Clara said. "I only ask that you let me prove it." He laughed again, colder this time, and stepped back from the door. "Very well," he said, 1 month, but you will earn every meal and every roof over your head. I will not carry dead weight in this house, Miss Whitfield. And when the month ends, you will leave without complaint. Do we have an understanding?" Clara nodded, relief flooding through her exhausted body. "Yes, Your Grace, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Sebastian said, turning and walking into the dim hallway. "You have not seen what I intend to give you to do." She followed him inside, and the door shut behind her with a heavy final sound. The interior of Ashcombe Manor was nothing like Clara had imagined from the outside grandeur. Dust coated the once elegant furniture. Cobwebs stretched across the corners of the high ceilings. Sheets covered several pieces of furniture in the main hall, as though the family had abandoned half the house and simply forgotten it existed. A single lamp burned in the entryway, casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Sebastian noticed her studying the state of the house and gave a short, bitter smile. "Not what you expected of a duke's home?" he asked. "It's not my place to have expectations," Clara answered carefully. "A diplomatic answer," he said. "We'll see how long that lasts." He led her through a maze of corridors, past closed doors and empty rooms, until they reached a small chamber near the back of the house, far from the family quarters. The room was plain, with a narrow bed, a chipped wash basin, and a single window that let in a sliver of gray evening light. "This will be your room," he said. "You will rise before dawn. Mrs. Bennet, my housekeeper, will assign your duties. I expect obedience, discretion, and silence, unless spoken to. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Good." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back at her with an unreadable expression. "You may find that surviving under this roof is harder than surviving out there in the storm." Clara held his gaze, refusing to let her exhaustion show as fear. "I have survived worse, Your Grace." Something flickered in his eyes at that, though he said nothing more. He simply nodded once and disappeared down the corridor, leaving her alone in the small, cold room. That night, Clara lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the wind howl against the window pane. She thought of everything that had brought her to this place, the loss of her family home, the betrayal that had left her with nothing, the long, lonely road that had led her, finally, to the door of a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with her. But she had not survived this long by giving up easily. She rose before dawn, exactly as instructed, and found her way to the kitchens, where an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner was already stoking the fire. This was Mrs. Bennet, the housekeeper, whose expression softened only slightly when she saw Clara standing in the doorway. "So you're the one who talked her way into staying," Mrs. Bennet said, looking her over. "The Duke doesn't usually let strangers cross his threshold, let alone sleep under his roof." "I only asked for a month," Clara said. "A month is longer than most people last in this house," Mrs. Bennet replied, though there was no cruelty in her tone, only weary honesty. "The Duke has not been himself since his brother passed. Since then, this house has been dying right along with him." Clara wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Bennet was already handing her a list of chores, each one more demanding than the last. She was to clean the east wing, which had not been touched in months. She was to inventory the linen closets, most of which were moth-eaten and forgotten. She was to help prepare meals, though the kitchen itself seemed to run on the barest of supplies. Clara accepted the list without complaint and got to work immediately. The east wing was worse than she expected. Dust lay so thick on the floors that her footsteps left prints behind her. Furniture sat abandoned beneath yellowed sheets, and the air smelled of neglect and old sorrow. She began at the far end of the corridor, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees, wiping down windows that had not seen daylight through clean glass in what felt like years. By midday, her arms ached and her back throbbed, but she did not stop. Sebastian passed through the wing once during the afternoon, his footsteps sharp against the newly cleaned floor. He paused when he saw her, kneeling beside a window, polishing the glass until it gleamed. He said nothing at first, simply watching her work with an expression she could not quite read. "You missed a spot," he said finally, nodding toward a corner of the windowsill. Clara looked up at him, unable to hide her surprise at the pettiness of the comment, but she simply nodded and moved to correct it without argument. "Yes, Your Grace." He lingered a moment longer, as though waiting for her to complain, to falter, to give him a reason to send her away early. When she said nothing more and simply continued her work, he turned and walked away without another word. Clara let out a slow breath once he was gone, her hands trembling slightly from the effort of holding her composure. She had not come this far to be broken by a man's cold stares and impossible standards. She had 1 month to prove she deserved to be here, and she intended to use every single day of it. As the sun began to set that evening, Clara stood at the window of the east wing, gazing out over the overgrown gardens that stretched behind the manor. Even in their neglected state, she could see traces of what they must once have been. Rows of rose bushes gone wild, a stone fountain choked with weeds, paths that had once been carefully tended now swallowed by grass. There was beauty buried beneath the decay, if someone was willing to dig it out. Clara pressed her palm against the cool glass and made herself a quiet promise. She would not simply survive this month. She would leave a mark on this house, whether the Duke wanted her to or not. Later that evening, Mrs. Bennet found her in the kitchen, wrapping a strip of cloth around a small cut on her palm from the broken glass she had cleared away that afternoon. The older woman clicked her tongue and took over the task, wrapping the wound with practiced hands. "You work harder than any lady I've ever seen cross this threshold," Mrs. Bennet said, not unkindly. "Most who come here expecting comfort leave within a day when they see the state of things." "I'm not looking for comfort," Clara said. "I'm looking for a chance." Mrs. Bennet studied her for a long moment, then set the bandage in place and folded her arms. This house was full of life once, laughter in the halls, music in the evenings, guests coming and going every season. Then the young master, the Duke's brother, was lost, and everything stopped. The old Duke, their father, fell ill soon after and never recovered. Sebastian inherited a title he never wanted, along with debts and grief he has no idea how to carry. Clara absorbed this quietly, understanding a little more now about the coldness she had faced at the door. That explains a great deal. "It explains nothing that excuses how he treats people," Mrs. Bennet said firmly. "But it does explain why he is the way he is. Be careful, girl. This house eats people who are not careful." "I intend to be very careful," Clara said, though something in her chest tightened at the warning. Mrs. Bennet gave her a long look, then softened slightly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be harder than today." Clara thanked her and made her way back to her small room, her body exhausted but her mind restless with everything she had learned. She thought of the Duke's sharp eyes, the way grief seemed to sit behind his coldness like a shadow he could not shake. She thought of the house itself, once alive, now hollow and waiting for something, or someone, to bring it back. She lay down on the narrow bed and closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Somewhere in the vast house above her, she could hear the faint, restless sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, long into the night. Behind her, unseen, Sebastian stood in the shadow of the doorway, watching the woman who had appeared out of the storm the night before. He told himself he was merely making certain she followed the rules of the house. He told himself that her presence meant nothing to him. But even as he turned away, he found he could not stop thinking about the fire in her eyes when she had refused to be intimidated by his coldness. It had been a long time since anyone in this house had looked at him without fear or pity. He did not know, not yet, how deeply that single month would change everything he thought he understood about his life, his home, and the walls he had built around his own broken heart. For now, he simply walked back to his study, closed the door, and told himself that Clara Whitfield was nothing more than a temporary arrangement, a debt owed to his aunt's memory, and nothing else at all. He was wrong, though he had no way of knowing it yet. The bucket of icy water tipped over the edge of the stone steps, splashing across Clara's boots and soaking through the hem of her dress before she could catch her balance. She gritted her teeth against the cold and kept scrubbing, refusing to let the sting of it slow her down. Sebastian had given Mrs. Bennet strict instructions that morning, instructions clearly designed to test how quickly Clara would break. She would not break. By the end of the first week, Clara had scrubbed every floor in the east wing, polished every window until it gleamed, and beaten the dust from curtains that had not been touched in years. Her hands were raw, her back ached constantly, and yet each morning she rose before dawn and returned to work without a single word of complaint. Sebastian noticed. He told himself he was simply keeping an eye on the household, making certain the stranger under his roof did not steal from him or cause trouble among the staff. But more and more he found himself walking through corridors he had long avoided, corridors that Clara had transformed from dust-covered tombs into rooms that almost looked lived in again. One afternoon he found her standing on a ladder in the library, carefully dusting the tops of the tall bookshelves that lined the walls. Sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows, illuminating shelves of books that had not seen proper light in years. "You've been busy," he said from the doorway, his tone carefully neutral. Clara startled slightly at his voice, but did not lose her footing. "There was a great deal to do, Your Grace. This library has not looked this clean since my mother passed," he said, stepping further into the room. He ran a hand along the spine of a book, his expression unreadable. "She used to read to my brother and me in here every evening. After she died, my father closed this room. No one has used it in years." Clara climbed down from the ladder carefully, wiping her hands on her apron. It seemed a shame to leave such beautiful books buried under dust. Sebastian's jaw tightened at the mention of the books, and for a moment, Clara worried she had overstepped. But instead of anger, something closer to sorrow passed across his face. "My brother loved this room," he said quietly. "He would have been furious to see it left like this. Then perhaps he would be glad to see it opened again," Clara offered gently. Sebastian's eyes met hers, sharp and searching, as though trying to determine whether her words were kindness or manipulation. He had learned, in the months since his brother's death and his father's decline, that people often said comforting things while wanting something in return. "Do not mistake my allowing you to stay for friendship, Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice cooling again. "You are here to work, nothing more." "I understand, Your Grace," Clara said, though something in her chest ached at the sharpness of his retreat. "I only meant to honor your family's memory, not to overstep." He said nothing more, simply turned and left the library, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Clara stood alone amid the shelves of books, wondering what kind of pain could turn a man so completely against warmth, against comfort, against the simple beauty of a room filled with light. She did not have long to dwell on it. Mrs. Bennet appeared moments later with a new list of tasks, longer than the last, clearly another test devised to push Clara toward her breaking point. The following days brought harder labor still. Clara was sent to the kitchen gardens, overgrown and neglected for years, and told to clear them by hand before the week's end. She worked from dawn until dusk, pulling weeds, turning soil, and salvaging what vegetables and herbs could still be saved beneath the tangled growth. The other servants began to take notice of her determination. A young maid named Margaret, who had been too intimidated by the Duke's coldness to speak much to newcomers, began bringing Clara small cups of tea during her breaks, offering quiet words of encouragement. "He's testing you," Margaret said one afternoon, watching Clara wipe sweat and dirt from her brow. "Everyone who's come through here in the last year, he's tested them the same way. None of them lasted more than a few days. Why does he do it?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. "After his brother died, and then his father, the Duke stopped trusting anyone," Margaret said. "He thinks if he pushes people away hard enough, fast enough, it won't hurt as much when they leave anyway." Clara considered this as she returned to her work, understanding a little more with each passing day about the walls Sebastian had built around himself. She did not excuse his coldness, but she began to understand the grief hiding beneath it, and something in her softened toward him despite herself. By the second week, the kitchen garden had begun to show signs of new life. Rows of vegetables, once buried beneath weeds, now stood in neat, tended lines. Herbs that had grown wild were trimmed and organized, ready to be used in the kitchen once more. Clara took quiet pride in the transformation, even though no one, least of all the Duke, had acknowledged her efforts directly. That changed one evening when Sebastian returned from a ride around the estate and passed by the garden on his way to the stables. He stopped abruptly, staring at the neat rows where tangled weeds had stood only days before. He found Clara still working, kneeling in the dirt as the sun began to set behind the hills. "You did this?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. Clara sat back on her heels and looked up at him, brushing dirt from her hands. "It seemed wasteful to let good soil go unused, Your Grace." Sebastian walked slowly along the rows, taking in the careful arrangement, the neatly trimmed herbs, the small stakes marking what had been planted where. For the first time since her arrival, his expression held something other than suspicion or coldness. It held, however briefly, a flicker of genuine admiration. "My mother used to keep this garden herself," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Before she died, this was her favorite place in the entire estate." "I didn't know that," Clara said softly. "How could you?" he replied, though there was no bite in his words this time. He crouched down beside one of the herb rows, running his fingers over the leaves of a rosemary plant that had somehow survived years of neglect. "She used to say that a garden reflects the state of the people who tend it. If that's true, this house has been in ruins for a very long time." Clara said nothing, sensing that he was speaking more to himself than to her, giving voice to thoughts he rarely allowed anyone to hear. She watched him carefully, this man who wore coldness like armor, and saw for the first time the depth of the grief he carried beneath it. "Thank you," he said finally, rising to his feet and brushing dirt from his trousers. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. "For the garden. It's the first time this place has looked like this in years." "You're welcome, Your Grace," Clara said, unable to keep a small smile from forming despite the ache in her back and the dirt caked beneath her fingernails. He gave her a short nod, then turned and walked toward the stables without another word, leaving Clara alone in the fading light. She sat back among the neat rows of vegetables and herbs, feeling something shift inside her, something she could not quite name but knew she needed to be careful of. She had come to Ashcombe Manor for shelter, for 1 month of safety before she moved on to whatever came next. She had not expected to feel anything for the cold, guarded man who owned this house, and yet here she was, watching him disappear into the darkness, wondering what secrets lay behind those sharp, sorrowful eyes. Before returning to the house that evening, Clara lingered a moment longer among the herb rows, watching the last light fade behind the hills. Margaret found her there, carrying 2 cups of tea and a look of quiet excitement on her face. "I heard what happened," Margaret said, handing her a cup. "The Duke actually thanked you. Do you know how long it's been since he thanked anyone in this house for anything?" Clara accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. "It was only a garden." "It was never only a garden to him," Margaret said, sitting down on the low stone wall bordering the herb beds. "His mother used to bring him and his brother out here when they were boys. He hasn't set foot in this part of the grounds since she passed, not once, not even to check on it." Clara considered this, turning the cup slowly in her hands. "Why do you stay here, Margaret? With everything you've told me about how difficult things have become." Margaret shrugged, though her expression turned thoughtful. "My mother worked in this house before me, and her mother before her. This place has been my whole life. Besides, the Duke wasn't always like this. Before his brother died, he used to laugh. He used to spend hours in the stables with the horses, teasing the younger staff, sneaking treats to the kitchen cats." She smiled faintly at the memory. "It's strange to think that man is still somewhere underneath all this coldness." "What happened to his brother?" Clara asked carefully, unsure if the question crossed a line she should not cross. Margaret's smile faded, and she glanced toward the manor, as though making certain no one else could hear. "There was an accident. A carriage accident, on the road returning from town late one night. His brother, Edward, was driving. Sebastian was meant to be with him that evening, but he'd stayed behind at the last moment for some matter of business. He's carried the guilt of it ever since, though no one blames him for what happened. No one but himself." Clara's chest tightened at the story, understanding now the depth of the wound Sebastian carried beneath his cold exterior. It was not simply grief for a lost brother, but the crushing weight of guilt for a tragedy he had no real power to prevent. "That explains so much," Clara murmured. "It doesn't excuse how he's treated people since," Margaret said firmly, echoing what Mrs. Bennet had told Clara days earlier. But it does help make sense of it. Just be careful, Clara. Men who carry guilt like that sometimes push away the very people who might help them carry it. Clara thought about those words long after Margaret had returned to the house, long after the sun had fully set, and the stars began to emerge over the quiet fields surrounding Ashcombe Manor. She understood now why Sebastian guarded himself so fiercely, why kindness seemed to unsettle him more than coldness ever could. She finished her tea slowly, watching the darkness settle over the garden she had spent 2 weeks bringing back to life, and made her way inside before the night grew too cold. The following days brought a shift in the rhythm of the household, subtle but unmistakable. Sebastian began appearing more frequently in the areas of the house Clara had restored, lingering in the library with a book he rarely opened, walking the garden paths in the early morning before the household stirred. He said little to her directly, but she often felt his gaze on her as she worked, thoughtful rather than suspicious now. Mrs. Bennet noticed the change as well, though she kept her observations largely to herself, offering only occasional knowing looks whenever Clara returned from a task that had, coincidentally, placed her in the same room as the Duke. One morning, Mrs. Bennet handed Clara a fresh assignment, with an unusual note of hesitation in her voice. "The Duke has asked that you assist him in the West Gallery today," she said. "It's not a request I expected him to make, given how carefully he's avoided that part of the house since his father's passing." "What's in the West Gallery?" Clara asked. "Portraits," Mrs. Bennet said simply. "Generations of Ashcombes, going back over 100 years. His father commissioned the last one just before he fell ill. The Duke hasn't looked at any of them since the funeral." Clara felt a flicker of apprehension at the assignment, sensing that whatever waited in that gallery carried weight far beyond simple dust and neglect. But she nodded and set off toward the west wing, uncertain what she would find, or what it might mean that Sebastian had chosen her, of all people, to help him face it. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind outside her window, Clara reminded herself firmly of the terms she had agreed to. 1 month, work for shelter, nothing more. She could not afford to lose sight of that agreement, not when her future depended on keeping her heart guarded just as carefully as the Duke guarded his own. But even as she made that promise to herself, she knew it would be far harder to keep than she wanted to admit. The following morning, Mrs. Bennet greeted her with a rare smile and news that the Duke had requested Clara's help in a new task, one that would take her far beyond the garden and into a part of the house she had not yet seen. Whatever walls Sebastian had built around himself, it seemed, were beginning, however slowly, to crack. The West Gallery door groaned as Clara pushed it open, releasing a breath of stale, cold air that had been trapped inside for months. Dust motes swirled in the pale morning light filtering through tall windows, illuminating rows of portraits that lined the walls on either side of the long corridor. Faces of long-dead Ashcombes stared down at her, some proud, some solemn, all silent witnesses to a family history she knew nothing about. Sebastian was already there when she arrived, standing perfectly still before a portrait near the far end of the gallery. He did not turn when she entered, though she knew he had heard the door. Clara approached slowly, unsure whether to speak or wait for him to acknowledge her presence. The portrait he stood before showed 2 young men, one clearly Sebastian, though younger and softer around the eyes, and the other a near mirror image of him, though with a warmer, more open expression. "My brother Edward," Sebastian said finally without turning. "This was painted the year before he died. My father commissioned it for his 40th birthday, wanting a portrait of both his sons together before we grew any older." "He looks like you," Clara said carefully. "He was better than me," Sebastian replied, his voice flat. "Kinder, more patient. Everyone loved Edward the moment they met him. I was always the serious one, the one who worried about ledgers and estate matters while Edward charmed every room he entered." Clara studied the portrait more closely, noting the easy warmth in Edward's painted smile, so different from the guarded coldness she had come to know in his brother. "You must miss him terribly." Sebastian's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something rawer, more honest than she had ever heard from him. "He was supposed to be with me that night," he said. "We were meant to travel together, back from a meeting with the estate solicitor. But I stayed behind, caught up in some argument over numbers that seemed important at the time and means nothing to me now." Edward went ahead alone. The roads were icy. The carriage overturned on a bend just outside the village. He paused, his hands clenching at his sides. "If I had gone with him, if I had simply left when he asked me to, he might still be alive." "You don't know that," Clara said gently. "An accident is exactly that, an accident. You cannot carry the weight of something you had no control over." "Can't I?" Sebastian turned to face her then, his eyes burning with a grief he had clearly kept locked away for far too long. I have had a year to imagine every possible way that night could have gone differently. Every choice I made that led to losing him. Don't tell me what I can and cannot carry, Miss Whitfield. You know nothing of what I've lost. The words struck harder than he perhaps intended, and Clara felt her own carefully guarded grief rising to the surface in response. She had not spoken of her own past to anyone in this house, not even to Mrs. Bennet or Margaret, but something in his raw honesty pulled the words from her before she could stop them. I know more than you think, she said quietly. My father died when I was 16. My mother followed 2 years later, worn down by grief and debts my father left behind. I lost the only home I'd ever known, when distant relatives claimed what little inheritance remained. I have spent the years since moving from one uncertain situation to the next, always one misfortune away from having nowhere to go at all. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to let her voice waver. So do not assume I cannot understand grief, Your Grace, simply because my losses did not come with a title attached to them. Sebastian stared at her, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of her response. Something shifted in his expression, the anger draining away into something closer to shame. I did not know, he said finally. You never asked, Clara replied, though not unkindly. You've spent so much time testing whether I would survive under this roof. You never once wondered what brought me to your door in the first place. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy between them, broken only by the faint creak of old floorboards beneath their feet. Sebastian looked back at the portrait of his brother, then at Clara, as though seeing her clearly for the first time since her arrival. Why did you come here? He asked, his voice quieter now. Truly, my aunt's letter explains little. Clara hesitated, weighing how much of the truth she was willing to share. Your aunt was kind to me once, years ago, when I had nowhere else to turn. She told me that if I ever found myself desperate again, Ashcombe Manor would take me in. I did not know she had passed until I arrived at your door. I am sorry for your loss, truly. She was the last connection I had to any kindness in this world. Sebastian absorbed this quietly, his expression unreadable. She never mentioned you to me. There was no reason for her to, Clara said. I was simply a stranger she helped once, nothing more. And yet you came all this way, on nothing more than the memory of a single kindness, Sebastian said, something almost like admiration creeping into his voice. I had nowhere else to go, Clara admitted. It was not entirely a matter of faith in your aunt's memory. It was also desperation. The honesty of her answer seemed to settle something between them, an unspoken understanding forming in the quiet gallery surrounded by the painted faces of the dead. Sebastian moved slowly along the row of portraits, gesturing for Clara to follow as he pointed out various ancestors, sharing small fragments of family history she suspected he rarely spoke of to anyone. They spent the better part of the morning in the gallery, cleaning frames and dusting portraits together, the work itself becoming almost secondary to the conversation that flowed, hesitant and careful at first, then gradually more open, between them. Clara learned of Sebastian's mother, who had died when he was barely 12, and of his father's slow decline into illness and despair after losing his eldest son. My father never recovered from Edward's death, Sebastian said, standing before the final portrait, the one commissioned just before his father's passing. It showed an older man with tired eyes, and a weary set to his shoulders, nothing like the proud figure in earlier paintings throughout the gallery. He blamed me, though he never said it outright. He didn't need to. I could see it in the way he looked at me every single day until he died. That must have been unbearable, Clara said softly. It was, Sebastian admitted, and when he passed, and the title fell to me, I told myself I would run this estate better than sentiment ever could. I closed off the rooms that reminded me too much of what I'd lost. I stopped receiving guests. I let the gardens fall into ruin because I could not bear to see my mother's favorite place flourishing without her in it. He glanced at Clara, something almost vulnerable in his expression. And then you arrived, and within 2 weeks, you have undone half of what I spent a year trying to bury. Clara wasn't certain whether his words were meant as accusation or gratitude, and the uncertainty in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely certain himself. I did not mean to intrude on your grief, she said carefully. You didn't intrude, he said, surprising her. You reminded me that this house was once alive, once full of warmth I had convinced myself I no longer deserved to feel. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. I have not spoken this openly about my brother or my father to anyone since the funeral. Not to Mrs. Bennet, not to the few acquaintances who still bother to call on me. I don't know why it feels different speaking to you. Perhaps because I understand what it means to carry grief alone, Clara said. It is a heavy thing to hold by yourself, Your Grace. Sebastian, he said suddenly. Clara blinked, uncertain she had heard him correctly. Your Grace? My name, he clarified, a faint, almost embarrassed edge to his voice. You may use it, if you wish, at least when we are alone. The formality feels absurd given everything we've just discussed. Something warm bloomed in Clara's chest at the small offering, an acknowledgement that whatever distance he had tried to maintain between them was beginning to soften. Sebastian, she repeated quietly, testing the shape of his name. He nodded, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth, the first genuine warmth she had seen from him since her arrival. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor outside the gallery. Margaret appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, her expression tense with concern. Your Grace, she said, addressing Sebastian directly, her eyes flicking briefly to Clara before returning to him. A letter has arrived, from Lord Gerald Pierce. He says he intends to visit within the fortnight, regarding matters of the estate's succession. Sebastian's entire demeanor shifted at the mention of the name, the brief warmth in his expression hardening back into something guarded and tense. Clara watched the change with growing unease, sensing that whoever this Lord Gerald Pierce was, his impending arrival threatened to undo whatever fragile progress had been made that morning. Thank you, Margaret, Sebastian said, his voice tight. That will be all. Margaret nodded and hurried away, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. Clara studied Sebastian carefully, noting the tension that had returned to his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched at the mere mention of his cousin's name. Who is Lord Gerald Pierce? She asked, though she suspected the answer would not be a pleasant one. My cousin, Sebastian said, his voice flat and cold once more, the openness of their conversation moments earlier seeming to retreat behind familiar walls. The next in line to inherit this title, should anything happen to prevent me from producing an heir or maintaining my position. He has coveted this estate since we were children, and he has never forgiven the fact that it passed to me rather than him. And he's coming here? Clara asked. It seems so, Sebastian said grimly. Which means, Miss Whitfield, that whatever peace this house has found in the past 2 weeks is about to be tested in ways far more dangerous than dust and neglected gardens. Clara felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the gallery, sensing that the fragile trust building between herself and Sebastian was about to face a challenge neither of them was fully prepared for. That evening, news of Lord Gerald Pierce's impending visit spread quickly through the household staff. Clara found the mood in the kitchen noticeably subdued as she helped Mrs. Bennet prepare supper, the usual chatter among the servants replaced by wary glances and hushed conversation. Lord Pierce hasn't set foot in this house in over a year, Mrs. Bennet said, kneading dough with more force than necessary. Not since the old Duke's funeral, when he made no secret of his disappointment that the title passed to Sebastian instead of falling to him through some legal technicality. Is he truly a threat? Clara asked, setting a stack of plates on the counter. He's a man who believes this house should belong to him, Mrs. Bennet said grimly. And men like that rarely give up their ambitions quietly. He'll come with smiles and fine words, mark my own, but underneath it all, he'll be looking for any weakness he can use against the Duke. Clara thought of Sebastian's tension in the gallery, the way his voice had hardened the moment his cousin's name was mentioned, and understood now the depth of history behind that reaction. Whatever peace had been building within these walls over the past 2 weeks suddenly felt fragile indeed, vulnerable to whatever storm Lord Pierce intended to bring with him. After supper was served and the kitchen work finally slowed, Clara found herself drawn back toward the gardens, needing air and space to think after the emotional weight of the day. The evening was cool but clear, stars beginning to emerge over the quiet fields surrounding the estate. She walked slowly along the paths she had cleared over the past 2 weeks, running her fingers absently over the herbs and flowers she had coaxed back to life. She was not entirely surprised when she heard footsteps approaching, and turned to find Sebastian walking toward her, his expression less guarded than it had been since Margaret's interruption in the gallery. I did not expect to find you out here so late, he said, coming to stand beside her near the stone fountain, now clear of weeds and beginning to show the elegant carved details hidden beneath years of neglect. I needed some air, Clara admitted. The news about your cousin seemed to unsettle the entire household. Sebastian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a rare display of visible frustration. It unsettles me as well, though I try not to let it show. Gerald has spent years waiting for any opportunity to claim what he believes should be his. My father's death, my own unmarried status, any perceived weakness in my management of the estate. He uses it all as ammunition in letters to the family solicitors and whispers among our extended relations. Why does he believe the title should belong to him? Clara asked. A matter of old family politics, Sebastian said, his tone weary. His branch of the family descends from my grandfather's younger brother. By most conventional lines of succession, the title would never have passed to him regardless of circumstance. But Gerald has convinced himself and tried to convince others that irregularities in my father's marriage documentation could call the legitimacy of my inheritance into question. Is there any truth to that claim? Clara asked carefully. None whatsoever, Sebastian said firmly. But truth has rarely stopped Gerald from pursuing what he wants. He is charming, persuasive, and utterly without scruples when it comes to matters of ambition. He will smile at you, compliment you, make you feel as though he is the most reasonable man in any room, all while quietly working to undermine everything you value. Clara considered this, watching moonlight ripple across the still water of the fountain. Then we should be prepared for his visit, rather than simply anxious about it. Sebastian glanced at her, something like surprise flickering across his features at her use of the word we. You intend to remain through his visit then? Your month is not yet finished, but I would understand if you preferred to avoid whatever unpleasantness Gerald intends to bring. I agreed to stay a month and work for my keep, Clara said simply. I do not intend to abandon that agreement simply because circumstances have become complicated. Something in Sebastian's expression softened at her words, gratitude mixing with an emotion he seemed reluctant to name even to himself. Thank you, Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it, spoken quietly beneath the stars, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest that she quickly tried to suppress. She reminded herself firmly of the boundaries she had set for herself, the careful distance she needed to maintain if she hoped to leave this house with her heart intact when her month finally ended. But standing beside him in the quiet garden, watching the tension in his shoulders ease if only slightly, Clara found it increasingly difficult to remember exactly why that distance mattered so much. We should prepare the house properly for his arrival, she said, forcing her thoughts back to practical matters. If Lord Pierce is looking for any sign of weakness or disorder to use against you, we should give him none. Sebastian nodded, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his usual reserve. A sound strategy. Perhaps my aunt's judgment of character was not so mistaken after all, Miss Whitfield. Clara, she corrected softly, echoing the gesture he had offered her earlier. Clara, he repeated, and the warmth in his voice as he said her name lingered in the cool evening air long after they had returned inside, each retreating to their separate quarters, though neither found sleep came easily that night. The carriage bearing Lord Gerald Pierce arrived exactly on time, its polished wheels crunching over the gravel drive as the household staff assembled outside the manor to greet him. Clara stood near the back of the group, dressed in her cleanest work clothes, watching as a tall, elegantly dressed man stepped down from the carriage with the easy confidence of someone who believed the entire estate already belonged to him. Gerald Pierce was handsome in a polished, deliberate way, his dark hair perfectly groomed, his coat tailored to perfection. He surveyed the manor's exterior with an appraising eye before his gaze settled on Sebastian, who stood at the top of the entrance steps with careful composure. Cousin, Gerald said, spreading his arms in a gesture of false warmth. It has been far too long. The estate looks remarkably improved since my last visit. I confess, I did not expect such industry from you. Gerald? Sebastian replied, his voice cool but civil. Welcome to Ashcombe Manor. I trust your journey was comfortable. Comfortable enough, Gerald said, his eyes sweeping over the assembled staff before landing curiously on Clara. And who is this? I don't believe I've had the pleasure. Miss Whitfield is assisting with the household, Sebastian said smoothly, offering no further explanation. She has been invaluable these past weeks. Gerald's gaze lingered on Clara a moment longer than necessary, a calculating expression crossing his features before he offered her a polite, if insincere, smile. A pleasure, Miss Whitfield. I look forward to learning more about your role here during my stay. Clara returned the smile with practiced neutrality, sensing immediately the truth of everything Sebastian and Mrs. Bennet had warned her about. There was something unsettling beneath Gerald's polished charm, a predatory patience that made her skin prickle with unease. Over the following days, Gerald settled into the manor with the ease of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. He toured the newly restored gardens with exaggerated compliments, remarked on the gleaming windows and dust-free rooms with a curiosity that felt more calculating than genuine, and asked pointed questions of the staff whenever he believed Sebastian was not within earshot. Clara did her best to avoid direct interaction with him, but it proved impossible to remain entirely invisible within the confines of the household. On the third day of his visit, she found herself alone in the library, reorganizing a shelf of books Sebastian had asked her to catalog, when Gerald appeared in the doorway, uninvited and unannounced. Miss Whitfield, he said, stepping into the room with an easy smile. I hoped I might find you here. This library has undergone quite a transformation. My cousin tells me you're responsible for much of the estate's recent improvement. I've simply done the work asked of me, my lord, Clara said carefully, keeping her attention on the books in her hands. Modest, Gerald observed, moving closer, though he kept a polite distance that made it difficult for Clara to object to his presence outright. Tell me, Miss Whitfield, how exactly did a woman with no apparent connections to this family come to find herself residing under my cousin's roof? Ashcombe men are not typically known for their charitable impulses toward strangers. The question carried an edge beneath its casual tone, and Clara understood immediately that Gerald was testing her, probing for weaknesses he could exploit. Your late aunt extended kindness to me some years ago, she said evenly. I came here on the strength of that connection, nothing more. How touching, Gerald said, though his expression suggested he found the explanation far from satisfying. And has my cousin been equally generous with his kindness since your arrival? The Duke has honored the terms of our agreement, Clara said, careful to keep her voice neutral despite the growing unease building in her chest. Gerald's smile widened slightly, and he took another step closer, lowering his voice, as though sharing a confidence. You should be careful, Miss Whitfield. My cousin has a history of forming attachments that end poorly for those involved. His father's illness, his brother's death, both left him rather unstable, if I'm being honest. I would hate to see a young woman such as yourself caught in the fallout of his particular brand of grief. The implication in his words was clear enough, and Clara felt anger rising sharply beneath her carefully maintained composure. I appreciate your concern, my lord, but I am quite capable of judging character for myself. Of course, Gerald said smoothly, though his eyes held something colder now, calculating rather than concerned. I only meant to offer friendly advice, given the circumstances of your rather precarious position here. Before Clara could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor, and Sebastian appeared in the doorway, his expression tightening the moment he took in the scene before him. Gerald, I wasn't aware you had business in the library. No business at all, Gerald said easily, straightening and offering his cousin an unbothered smile. Simply admiring the improvements Miss Whitfield has made to this room. We were having a most illuminating conversation. Sebastian's gaze flicked to Clara, searching her expression for any sign of distress. Whatever he found there caused his jaw to tighten further. Miss Whitfield has considerable work still to complete this afternoon. I'm certain you have matters of your own to attend to, Gerald. Gerald inclined his head, unbothered by the obvious dismissal. Of course, cousin. I'll leave you both to your work. He offered Clara one final lingering look before departing, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with unhurried confidence. Once he was gone, Sebastian turned to Clara, concern evident in his expression. Are you all right? What did he say to you? Nothing of consequence, Clara said, though her voice carried a slight tremor she couldn't quite suppress. He seemed interested in learning more about my presence here, and he offered some rather pointed observations about your character. Sebastian's expression darkened. I can imagine the nature of those observations. Gerald has spent years perfecting the art of planting doubt through carefully chosen words. He will say nothing outright cruel, nothing that could be repeated as evidence of ill intent, but he is skilled at making people question everything around them. He suggested I should be careful of forming attachments here, Clara said quietly, watching Sebastian's reaction closely. Something flickered across his face, an emotion he quickly schooled back into careful neutrality. And what did you tell him? That I was capable of judging character for myself, Clara said. A faint, genuine smile touched Sebastian's mouth, despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. Good. Do not let him unsettle you, Clara. Everything he says is calculated to serve his own purposes. He has no genuine concern for your welfare or mine. I understand that, Clara said, but I confess, his presence in this house makes me uneasy. There's something predatory about the way he watches everyone, as though he's already calculating how best to use whatever he learns against you. That is precisely who Gerald is, Sebastian said grimly, and precisely why I need you to be careful during his stay. He will look for any weakness, any irregularity, any relationship he can twist into evidence against my character or judgment. The longer he remains here, the more dangerous his presence becomes. Clara nodded, understanding the weight of the warning even as a small, unwelcome thought crossed her mind. If Gerald was searching for relationships to exploit, the growing closeness between herself and Sebastian, however carefully guarded, represented exactly the kind of vulnerability he would seize upon without hesitation. How long does he intend to stay? She asked. He mentioned a fortnight when he rode ahead, Sebastian said, though knowing Gerald, He will extend his visit as long as necessary to gather whatever information he believes will serve his ambitions. We should proceed carefully during his time here, Clara, for both our sakes." The warning settled uneasily in Clara's chest as she returned to her work that afternoon, Gerald's calculating smile and pointed questions lingering in her thoughts long after he had left the library. She had come to Ashcombe Manor seeking nothing more than temporary shelter, and yet with each passing day, the stakes of her presence here seemed to grow more complicated, more dangerous, and more difficult to untangle from the growing warmth she felt toward the man whose house she had been so reluctantly welcomed into. That evening, as she helped Mrs. Bennet prepare for the following day's meals, the older woman pulled her aside with a grave expression. "I saw Lord Pierce leaving the library this afternoon," Mrs. Bennet said quietly. "Whatever he said to you, girl, guard yourself carefully. That man has a talent for finding exactly where people are most vulnerable, and pressing until they break. I intend to be careful," Clara assured her, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered whether careful would prove to be enough against a man as calculating and patient as Gerald Pierce clearly was. Outside, the sound of Gerald's laughter carried faintly from the drawing room, where he had settled in for the evening with a glass of the estate's finest brandy, already beginning to weave whatever web of doubt and manipulation he had traveled so far to construct. Later that night, unable to sleep, Clara made her way quietly to the kitchen for a cup of warm milk, hoping it might settle the restless unease that had followed her since her conversation with Gerald in the library. She had not expected to find Sebastian already there, sitting alone at the wooden table with a single candle burning low, a stack of ledgers spread out before him. "You're awake late," she said softly, hesitating in the doorway. "I could say the same of you," he replied, gesturing for her to enter. "I find sleep difficult whenever Gerald is under this roof. Old habits, I suppose. I used to lie awake as a boy, listening for the sound of him sneaking into my father's study, to read correspondence he had no right to see." Clara sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the cup of warm milk Mrs. Bennet had left ready on the stove. "He was like this even as a child?" "Worse, in some ways," Sebastian said, closing one of the ledgers with a tired sigh. "Children are often cruel without understanding the weight of their actions. Gerald understood exactly what he was doing, even then. He simply lacked the patience and resources to act on his ambitions the way he can now." "What is he truly after?" Clara asked. "Beyond the title itself, I mean. What does he hope to gain by unsettling you, by planting doubt among the staff?" Sebastian considered the question carefully before answering. "Gerald believes that if he can demonstrate instability in my management of the estate, enough irregularity or scandal to raise questions among the family solicitors and the wider peerage, he might convince the courts to reconsider the succession in his favor. It is a long and difficult path, and unlikely to succeed given the strength of my claim. But Gerald has never been a man to abandon a scheme simply because it seems improbable. And my presence here," Clara said slowly, understanding dawning, "gives him exactly the kind of irregularity he's looking for." Sebastian's expression grew troubled. "I fear it might. An unmarried woman of uncertain origins, residing under my roof with no formal position beyond household labor, could be twisted into precisely the sort of scandal Gerald hopes to manufacture. I should have considered this more carefully before allowing you to stay." "You have nothing to apologize for," Clara said firmly. "I chose to come here, and I chose to stay through his visit. If Gerald wishes to twist an honest arrangement into something scandalous, that reflects poorly on his character, not on either of ours." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, something like admiration softening the tired lines of his face. "You are remarkably steady, Clara, for someone facing such uncertain circumstances." "I've had a great deal of practice remaining steady through uncertainty," she said with a faint, wry smile. "It is one of the few skills my difficult years have given me." He returned her smile, however briefly, before his expression sobered once more. "Regardless, we should proceed with caution while Gerald remains here. I do not wish to see your reputation or your safety compromised by his schemes." "I appreciate your concern," Clara said, "but I did not come this far, through everything I've survived, to be frightened away by a man like Gerald Pierce. Whatever he intends, we will face it together, if you'll allow it." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression at her words, gratitude, and something warmer still passing across his features before he carefully composed himself once more. "Together then," he agreed quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, the candle burning low between them, before Clara finally rose to return to her room, leaving Sebastian alone with his ledgers and his thoughts. As she made her way down the darkened corridor, she could not shake the growing certainty that Gerald's visit would test not only Sebastian's claim to his estate, but the fragile, unspoken bond that had begun to form between herself and the guarded Duke of Ashcombe Manor. The whispers began 3 days later, spreading through the household like smoke under a closed door. Clara first noticed the change during breakfast preparations, when 2 of the younger maids fell silent the moment she entered the kitchen, exchanging uneasy glances before returning to their tasks without meeting her eyes. "What's happened?" Clara asked Margaret quietly, once the other maids had scattered to their morning duties. Margaret hesitated, clearly reluctant to repeat whatever gossip had taken hold. "Lord Pierce has been talking, Clara. To the stable hands, to the kitchen staff, to anyone who will listen. He's suggesting that your presence here is improper, that you arrived with no real connection to the family, that the Duke has been unusually generous with you in ways that suggest something beyond a simple household arrangement." Clara felt her stomach tighten with dread, though she had suspected something like this was coming since her uneasy conversation with Gerald in the library. "What exactly is he saying?" "That you've charmed your way into his favor," Margaret said, clearly uncomfortable delivering the words. "That perhaps you're not who you claim to be at all. Some are even saying you might be after his fortune, working some kind of scheme to secure your position here permanently." The accusation stung sharply despite Clara's attempts to remain composed. She had worked tirelessly since her arrival, scrubbing floors and tending gardens with nothing but the promise of temporary shelter as her reward. And now Gerald's carefully planted lies threatened to undo weeks of honest labor with nothing but calculated suspicion. "None of that is true," Clara said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I know that," Margaret said quickly. "Most of the staff who've worked alongside you know it too. But Lord Pierce has a talent for making doubt sound reasonable, especially to those who haven't seen your work firsthand. And he's been speaking with some of the tenant families as well, spreading the same suggestions beyond just the household." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she absorbed the full scope of Gerald's campaign against her. This was no longer simply pointed conversation in the library, testing her resolve. This was a deliberate, calculated effort to destroy her reputation and, through her, undermine Sebastian's judgment and standing. She found Sebastian later that morning in his study, his expression already grim, suggesting he had heard the same rumors circulating through the household. "You've heard what he's saying," Clara said, closing the door behind her. "I have," Sebastian confirmed, rising from his desk with visible anger tightening his features. "Gerald has overstepped considerably this time. I intend to speak with him directly." "Will that help?" Clara asked doubtfully. "Or will it simply give him more material to twist into further accusations?" Sebastian paused, clearly recognizing the truth in her concern. "You're right that direct confrontation plays into exactly the kind of narrative he wants to construct, but I cannot allow him to slander you under my own roof without consequence." "There must be another way to address this," Clara said, pacing anxiously before the tall windows of the study. "Something that exposes his lies without appearing to validate them through obvious conflict." Before Sebastian could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the study door, and Gerald himself entered without waiting for an invitation, his expression carefully arranged into one of polite concern. "Cousin," he said smoothly, glancing between Sebastian and Clara with feigned innocence. "I hoped I might have a word regarding certain matters that have come to my attention." "I've heard precisely what matters you've brought to the attention of my entire household," Sebastian said coldly. "I would advise you to reconsider whatever scheme you're attempting, Gerald. Spreading baseless rumors about Miss Whitfield will not serve whatever purpose you imagine it might." "Baseless?" Gerald raised an eyebrow, his tone carrying false surprise. "I've merely repeated observations others have shared with me. A young woman of unknown origin, welcomed into your home under circumstances that remain, shall we say, unclear. Spending considerable private time with the Duke himself, if the staff's accounts are to be believed. Forgive me if such details raise reasonable questions. Miss Whitfield came to this house on the strength of a connection to my late aunt," Sebastian said, his voice hard as stone. "She has worked tirelessly since her arrival, earning her place through honest labor. Any suggestion otherwise is a deliberate fabrication designed to serve your own ambitions." Gerald's expression shifted, the polite mask slipping slightly to reveal something colder beneath. "My ambitions, cousin, extend only to protecting the reputation and legacy of this family. If you cannot see how your behavior toward this woman might be perceived by those less generous than myself, then perhaps my concerns are more valid than you wish to admit." "Get out of my study, Gerald," Sebastian said, his voice dangerously quiet. Gerald offered a thin, unpleasant smile, bowing slightly before turning toward the door. "As you wish, cousin, though I suspect this conversation is far from finished. These matters have a way of finding their way to the attention of family solicitors, and beyond, whether we wish them to or not." The door closed behind him with a soft, deliberate click, leaving Sebastian and Clara alone in tense silence. "He intends to use this against your inheritance claim," Clara said quietly, understanding now the full weight of Gerald's scheme. Yes, Sebastian confirmed grimly, and unfortunately, he may find sympathetic ears among certain members of the family council, particularly those who have long questioned my father's decision to leave the estate solely in my hands rather than dividing responsibilities among extended relations. Clara felt the weight of the situation settling heavily upon her, understanding that her presence, however innocent, had become a genuine liability to the man who had shown her nothing but growing kindness since her arrival. "Perhaps I should leave," she said slowly, the words difficult to speak despite their obvious logic. "If my presence here threatens your position, threatens everything you've worked to rebuild since your father's death, then remaining would be selfish of me." "No," Sebastian said immediately, his voice sharp with an intensity that surprised them both. "I will not allow Gerald's manipulations to drive you from this house, Clara. You have done nothing wrong. Leaving now would only confirm his lies in the eyes of anyone inclined to believe them. But if it protects your claim to the estate, it would protect nothing," Sebastian interrupted firmly. "Gerald would simply find another angle to exploit, another vulnerability to twist into scandal. Running from this situation solves nothing except giving him exactly the victory he's hoping for." Clara studied his determined expression, torn between relief at his loyalty and fear of what remaining might cost him. "I don't want to be the reason you lose everything you've worked to rebuild." "You are not the reason," Sebastian said, his voice softening. "Gerald is the reason, his ambition, his willingness to manufacture scandal from nothing. That is what threatens this estate, not your presence within it." He paused, something vulnerable crossing his features. "In the weeks since you arrived, Clara, you have brought more life back into this house than I believed possible after everything we lost. I will not let Gerald's schemes undo that simply because he lacks the character to accept defeat gracefully." The sincerity in his words settled something anxious in Clara's chest, though the danger of their situation remained undeniably real. "Then what do we do?" she asked. "We gather evidence of our own," Sebastian said, his expression turning thoughtful and determined. "Gerald has built his career on manipulation and half-truths, but a man who lies as frequently as he does inevitably leaves evidence of his deceptions, if one knows where to look. I intend to find that evidence before he can do further damage to your reputation or my standing." Over the following days, Clara found herself drawn into a quiet, careful investigation alongside Sebastian, the two of them reviewing old correspondence, questioning trusted staff members discreetly, and piecing together a pattern of manipulation that stretched back years before Gerald's current visit. Mrs. Bennet proved particularly helpful, recalling instances of Gerald's past visits where similar schemes had been attempted against other members of the household and extended family. "He tried something similar 3 years ago," Mrs. Bennet confided one evening, after the rest of the staff had retired for the night. "Spread rumors about a distant cousin's business dealings, hoping to discredit him before an important family vote regarding shared investments. It nearly worked, until evidence surfaced proving the rumors were entirely fabricated." "What kind of evidence?" Clara asked. "Letters," Mrs. Bennet said. "Gerald has a habit of putting his true intentions in writing when he believes his correspondence will remain private. He's grown careless over the years, confident that his charm will protect him from scrutiny." This revelation gave Clara and Sebastian a clearer direction for their efforts, though finding concrete evidence of Gerald's current scheme proved considerably more difficult than uncovering rumors of his past behavior. Gerald remained cautious during his visit, careful not to leave obvious traces of his manipulations where Sebastian might easily discover them. The tension in the household grew steadily worse as the days passed. Whispers continued to circulate despite Sebastian's efforts to address them directly with the staff, and Clara found herself increasingly isolated, greeted with polite but distant courtesy by servants who had, only weeks earlier, welcomed her with genuine warmth. The weight of suspicion, however unfounded, pressed heavily upon her, and by the end of the week, she found herself questioning whether her presence truly was doing more harm than good, regardless of Sebastian's insistence otherwise. She stood alone in the garden one evening, watching the sun set behind the hills, when Margaret found her there, her expression troubled. "Lord Pierce has written to the family solicitor," Margaret said quietly. "I overheard him dictating the letter to his valet this afternoon. He's requesting a formal inquiry into the Duke's household arrangements, citing concerns about impropriety and questionable judgment." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of the danger settling over her like a physical burden. "This is exactly what he wanted from the beginning," she murmured. "To manufacture enough doubt and scandal to force some kind of formal review, weakening Sebastian's standing regardless of whether the accusations prove true." "What will you do?" Margaret asked. Clara did not have an answer, not yet, but as she watched the last light fade from the sky, She knew that whatever came next would determine not only her own future, but the fate of everything Sebastian had worked so carefully to rebuild since the tragedy that had first brought her to his door. That night, unable to settle her racing thoughts, Clara made a difficult decision. She returned to her small room and began quietly folding what few belongings she had brought with her, placing them carefully back into the worn suitcase that had carried her here through the storm weeks earlier. If her presence was truly the weapon Gerald needed to threaten Sebastian's inheritance, then perhaps the only way to protect him was to remove that weapon entirely, regardless of the promise she had made to stay through his cousin's visit. She was fastening the last strap on her suitcase when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Sebastian standing in the corridor, his expression immediately tightening as he took in the packed bag behind her. "What is this?" he asked, though the answer was plainly evident. "I've decided to leave," Clara said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the ache building in her chest. "Tonight, before Gerald can do further damage. If I'm gone, his accusations lose their foundation entirely." "No," Sebastian said firmly, stepping into the room without invitation. "I told you already, Clara. I will not allow his manipulations to drive you away." "This isn't about allowing anything," Clara said, her voice rising slightly with frustration and barely restrained emotion. "This is about protecting what matters to you. Your title, your estate, everything you've worked to rebuild since your father's death. I will not be the reason you lose it all to a man like Gerald Pierce." "You are not the reason," Sebastian repeated, closing the distance between them. "Listen to me carefully, Clara. If you leave tonight, running from lies that were never true to begin with, you hand Gerald exactly the victory he's been hoping for. He will claim your departure as proof of guilt, evidence that his accusations held merit all along. The only way to truly defeat him is to remain, to stand firmly against his lies, and to force him to answer for the falsehoods he spread." Clara hesitated, recognizing the logic in his argument even as fear and exhaustion urged her toward the safety of flight. "And if remaining costs you everything regardless, then it cost me everything while standing beside someone who has shown more honesty and courage in these past weeks than my own cousin has shown in his entire life," Sebastian said, his voice softening even as his conviction remained unshaken. "I would rather lose this estate defending what is right than keep it by abandoning you to protect my own comfort." The intensity of his words settled something deep within Clara's chest, chasing away some of the fear that had driven her toward the suitcase in the first place. "You truly believe we can defeat him?" "I believe truth has a way of surfacing, eventually, if given the chance," Sebastian said, "and I believe you deserve better than to be driven from this house by a man who has never once acted with honesty in his entire life." Clara looked down at the suitcase, then back up at Sebastian, seeing in his expression a determination that matched the quiet strength she had carried with her since her arrival at his door weeks earlier. Slowly, she reached down and unfastened the strap she had just secured. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll stay, but we need to move quickly, Sebastian. If Gerald has already written to the solicitor, we have very little time before his accusations become something far more difficult to undo." Relief flooded across Sebastian's features, followed quickly by renewed determination. "Then we work through the night if necessary." Mrs. Bennet mentioned Gerald's history of careless correspondence. If similar evidence exists from his current scheme, we need to find it before he realizes we're looking. Together, they made their way quietly to the study, where Sebastian retrieved a small ring of keys from a locked drawer in his desk. Gerald has been using the guest study adjoining his chambers for his correspondence. If he's grown as careless as Mrs. Bennet suggests, there may be drafts or discarded letters we can use to prove the deliberate nature of his accusations. The idea of searching through Gerald's private belongings unsettled Clara, though she understood the necessity given the stakes involved. Is this wise? If he discovers what we've done, he will have far greater concerns than our methods, should we find what I suspect is waiting there, Sebastian said grimly, leading her through the darkened corridors toward the guest wing where Gerald had taken up residence during his stay. They moved carefully through the sleeping household, the only sound their soft footsteps against the old wooden floors and the distant howl of wind outside the tall windows. When they reached the guest study, Sebastian used a spare key to unlock the door, the two of them slipping inside and closing it quietly behind them. The room was neat, almost obsessively so, papers stacked in careful order across a small writing desk near the window. Clara began searching methodically while Sebastian checked the drawers, both of them working quickly and quietly, aware of the risk should Gerald or his valet discover them there. It was Clara who found it first, tucked beneath a stack of seemingly innocent correspondence regarding estate matters. A single sheet of paper, covered in Gerald's precise handwriting, outlining in explicit detail a plan to manufacture scandal around Sebastian's household arrangements. specifically naming Clara as a convenient tool for undermining his cousin's reputation before the family council. "Sebastian," she whispered urgently, holding up the incriminating page. He crossed the room quickly, reading over her shoulder, his expression darkening with each line. "This is exactly what we needed," he said quietly, though his voice carried a mixture of relief and renewed anger at his cousin's calculated cruelty. Undeniable proof that his accusations were fabricated from the very beginning, designed purely to serve his ambitions. Clara carefully folded the letter, tucking it safely into the pocket of her dress. "We should return this exactly as we found it, in case he checks these papers before we're ready to reveal what we know." Sebastian nodded, quickly making a copy of the letter's contents in his own hand, before returning the original precisely to its place beneath the stack of correspondence. They slipped from the room as quietly as they had entered, making their way back through the darkened house with the weight of their discovery settling heavily, and hopefully, victoriously, between them. "Tomorrow," Sebastian said, once they had returned safely to the main house, "we confront him, publicly if necessary, before the entire household and any witnesses who might carry word of the truth beyond these walls." Clara nodded, exhaustion and adrenaline warring within her, though beneath both emotions ran a steady thread of hope she had not allowed herself to feel since Gerald's scheme had first begun to unfold. "Together," she said, echoing the promise they had made to each other days earlier. "Together," Sebastian confirmed, and in the quiet darkness of the corridor, something passed between them that neither dared name aloud, though both understood, with growing certainty, that whatever happened next would change everything between them, regardless of how Gerald's scheme finally unraveled. The morning sun had barely risen over Ashcombe Manor when Sebastian summoned the entire household staff, along with a hastily invited group of neighboring gentry and family acquaintances, to gather in the main hall. Word had spread overnight that the Duke intended to address the rumors circulating throughout the estate, and by the time Clara made her way downstairs, the hall was already filled with curious faces, whispered speculation, and an unmistakable air of tension. Gerald arrived last, dressed impeccably as always, his expression carefully arranged into one of mild concern as he surveyed the assembled crowd. "Cousin," he said, approaching Sebastian with practiced ease, "what is the meaning of this gathering? Surely whatever concerns you wish to address could be handled privately." "Some matters require witnesses, Gerald," Sebastian said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, "particularly when those matters involve deliberate deception spread throughout my household and beyond, threatening the reputation of an innocent woman under my protection." A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the assembled crowd. Gerald's expression flickered, though he quickly recovered his composure. "I'm not certain what you're implying, cousin, but I assure you, any concerns I've raised regarding your household arrangements were offered purely out of family loyalty and genuine worry." "Is that so?" Sebastian said, reaching into his coat and withdrawing the copied letter he had transcribed the night before. "Then perhaps you can explain this, Gerald. A detailed account, in your own hand, outlining a deliberate scheme to manufacture scandal around Miss Whitfield's presence in this household, designed explicitly to undermine my standing before the family council." The color drained slightly from Gerald's face, though he maintained his composure with visible effort. "I have no idea what fabrication you're presenting, Sebastian, but I assure you, the original document remains in your guest study, Gerald, precisely where you left it," Sebastian interrupted, his voice hard and unyielding. "I would be happy to have it retrieved before this entire assembly, if you wish to continue denying its existence." The murmurs in the hall grew louder, several of the gathered gentry exchanging pointed glances as the full weight of Sebastian's accusations settled over the room. Gerald's carefully maintained mask began to crack, anger flashing briefly across his features before he forced it back beneath a veneer of wounded innocence. "You would take the word of a household servant over your own family," Gerald said, his voice tight with barely restrained fury, "based on a document you claim to have found through means that sound remarkably like trespass into my private correspondence. I would take evidence in your own handwriting over your empty protestations, regardless of how it was obtained," Sebastian replied evenly. "And Miss Whitfield is not merely a household servant, Gerald. She has worked tirelessly since her arrival, transforming this house through honest labor, asking for nothing beyond the shelter she was promised. Your attempts to twist that honesty into scandal reveal far more about your own character than hers." Clara stood near the edge of the gathered crowd, her heart pounding as she watched Sebastian defend her so publicly, so completely, before witnesses who held real influence over both their futures. She had not expected such a direct confrontation, and the sight of Sebastian standing firmly against his cousin, refusing to back down despite the risk to his own reputation, filled her with a mixture of gratitude and fierce admiration she struggled to contain. "This is absurd," Gerald said, turning to address the assembled crowd directly, attempting to salvage what remained of his credibility. "My cousin has clearly formed an inappropriate attachment to this woman, and now seeks to punish me simply for raising legitimate concerns about—" "Enough, Gerald," a new voice interrupted, cutting through the tension with unexpected authority. Lord Aldrich Whitmore, an elder statesman among the local gentry and longtime friend of Sebastian's late father, stepped forward from the crowd, his expression grave. "I have known this family for over 30 years, and I have watched you circle this estate like a vulture since your uncle's passing, waiting for any opportunity to claim what was never rightfully yours. If Sebastian holds evidence of deliberate deception in your own hand, I suggest you answer for it honestly, rather than continuing this pathetic display of wounded innocence." The intervention seemed to break something in Gerald's composure entirely. His shoulders sagged slightly, the polished confidence that had carried him through his entire visit finally crumbling beneath the weight of exposed truth. "You cannot possibly understand the position I've been left in," he said, his voice losing its earlier smoothness. "Watching this title, this estate, pass to a man who nearly threw it all away through his own recklessness and grief, while I was left with nothing despite my own qualifications to manage such responsibilities. Whatever grievances you hold regarding the succession, Gerald, do not excuse deliberate cruelty toward an innocent woman who has done nothing but bring life back into a house that had been dying long before her arrival," Sebastian said, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. "I am willing to overlook your ambitions, however misguided. I am not willing to overlook the deliberate harm you've caused Miss Whitfield through your lies." Gerald looked around the hall, taking in the disapproving expressions of the assembled gentry, the quiet solidarity evident among the household staff who had gathered to witness the confrontation. Whatever support he had hoped to find for his scheme had clearly evaporated entirely. "This isn't finished," he said finally, though the threat carried little weight beneath his obvious defeat. "The family council will hear of this regardless." "They will hear the truth then," Sebastian said calmly. "Which is precisely what I intended from the beginning." Gerald offered one final venomous look toward Clara before turning and striding from the hall, his valet hurrying to gather his belongings as he departed. The remaining crowd watched him go in tense silence, broken only once the sound of his carriage finally faded down the long drive away from Ashcombe Manor. A collective breath seemed to release throughout the hall, tension giving way to quiet relief and murmured conversation among the gathered witnesses. Lord Whitmore approached Sebastian and Clara both, offering a respectful nod. "Well handled, young man," he said to Sebastian. "Your father would be proud of how you've defended both your household and your judgment today." "Thank you, Lord Whitmore," Sebastian said, genuine gratitude evident in his voice. "Your support today meant more than you know." As the gathered gentry began to disperse, offering their own words of support and reassurance to both Sebastian and Clara, Mrs. Bennet approached with tears of relief glistening in her eyes. "I always knew that man was trouble," she said, embracing Clara warmly. "But I never expected to see him so thoroughly defeated in his own scheme." Margaret joined them as well, her earlier caution replaced entirely with open joy. "The whole household is relieved, Clara. No one truly believed his lies, not really. We're simply glad the truth came out so clearly." As the hall gradually emptied, Sebastian found Clara standing near the tall windows, watching the last of the departing carriages disappear down the drive. He approached quietly, his expression softer now than she had seen since her arrival weeks earlier. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying, for trusting me enough to face this together, rather than running when the danger seemed greatest." "I told you I intended to honor our agreement," Clara said, though her voice carried warmth beyond simple duty now. "Though I confess, I did not expect our arrangement to lead to quite so dramatic a conclusion." Sebastian's mouth curved into a genuine smile, the first truly unguarded expression she had seen from him since their earliest, tense conversations weeks before. "Nor did I, though I find myself grateful for every unexpected turn that led us here." Clara felt her heart quicken at the warmth in his voice, the openness in his expression that had been so carefully guarded when she first arrived at his door. Soaked and desperate, begging for a single month of shelter. That month had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated, something that had grown steadily beneath the surface of hard labor and careful conversation, until it had become impossible to ignore any longer. "Your month ends in 3 days," Sebastian said quietly, watching her carefully. "I'm aware," Clara said, uncertainty creeping into her voice despite everything they had faced together. "I suppose I should begin considering where I'll go next." "Must you go anywhere at all?" Sebastian asked, the question carrying weight far beyond its simple phrasing. Clara turned to face him fully, searching his expression for meaning behind his words. "What are you asking, Sebastian?" He hesitated only a moment before continuing, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his eyes. "I am asking you to stay, Clara. Not as household help, not as a temporary arrangement bound by a single month's agreement, but as something far more permanent. You arrived at my door a stranger, and in the weeks since, you have brought this house back to life in ways I believed impossible after everything we lost. More than that, you have brought me back to life as well, reminding me that warmth and connection remain possible, even after profound grief." Clara's breath caught at the sincerity in his words, hope and disbelief warring within her chest. "Sebastian, I have nothing to offer you. No title, no fortune, no family connections that would benefit this estate. You have offered me more than any title or fortune ever could," Sebastian said, closing the distance between them. "Honesty, courage, warmth I had convinced myself I no longer deserved to feel. I am not asking you to stay out of obligation or convenience, Clara. I am asking because these past weeks, however difficult, have shown me exactly what kind of partner I want beside me, for whatever challenges the future might bring." Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, though they were tears of overwhelming relief and joy, rather than the sorrow that had accompanied so much of her recent past. "Are you certain? After everything Gerald tried to use against us, after all the danger this attachment nearly brought upon your inheritance?" "More certain than I have been about anything since before my brother's death," Sebastian said softly. "Stay, Clara, not for 1 month, but for however long you'll have me." Clara reached up, gently touching his face, feeling the warmth beneath her palm, where such coldness had once resided. "Then yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll stay." Sebastian's expression broke into a smile of pure, unguarded joy, and he pulled her carefully into an embrace that spoke of everything neither of them had been able to voice through the weeks of careful distance and gradual trust. Outside the tall windows, sunlight streamed across the newly restored gardens, illuminating roses that had begun to bloom again after years of neglect, a fitting mirror to the transformation taking place within the walls of Ashcombe Manor itself. In the days that followed, word of Gerald's failed scheme spread quietly through the wider family circle, effectively ending whatever remaining ambitions he held toward the estate and title. Sebastian's standing among the family council only strengthened in the aftermath, his handling of the crisis earning him respect he had struggled to command since inheriting his position under such tragic circumstances. Clara took on a new role within the household, no longer confined to the labor that had once defined her days, though she continued to oversee the restoration of the gardens and library that had first brought her and Sebastian together in quiet, honest conversation. The house itself seemed to breathe easier with each passing week, its rooms filled once more with warmth, laughter, and the steady rhythm of life that had been absent for far too long. Mrs. Bennet often remarked, with evident satisfaction, that Ashcombe Manor had not felt so alive since the days before tragedy first darkened its halls. And Sebastian, watching Clara tend the garden his mother had once loved so dearly, found himself agreeing wholeheartedly, grateful beyond measure for the storm that had once brought a desperate, determined stranger to his door. Several weeks later, on a crisp autumn evening, Sebastian led Clara out to the garden fountain, now fully restored and gleaming beneath the last light of sunset. He had spent the afternoon quietly arranging for the household staff to prepare a small gathering nearby, though he kept the true purpose of the evening carefully hidden from Clara as they walked the familiar paths together. "You've been unusually secretive today," Clara observed, glancing at him with curious amusement as they approached the fountain. "I have a reason for my secrecy," Sebastian admitted, a nervous energy evident beneath his usual composed demeanor. He stopped beside the fountain, turning to face her fully, his expression suddenly serious. "Clara, these past months have shown me a version of myself I believed I had lost forever, buried beneath grief and guilt I thought would never lift. You did not simply restore this house, you restored me." Clara's breath caught at the raw sincerity in his voice, sensing the weight of whatever he intended to say next. "Sebastian, let me finish," he said gently, reaching into his coat and withdrawing a small velvet box that had clearly belonged to the family for generations. Judging by its worn edges and careful craftsmanship, he opened it to reveal a delicate ring, an heirloom that caught the last light of the setting sun. "This belonged to my mother. She wore it every day until her passing, and I have kept it locked away since, unable to imagine anyone deserving of wearing it in her place, until now." Clara's hands trembled as she looked from the ring to Sebastian's earnest expression, tears already gathering in her eyes despite her attempts to remain composed. "Clara Whitfield," Sebastian said, lowering himself to one knee beside the fountain his mother had once loved so dearly. "You arrived at my door a stranger, desperate and soaked from the storm, asking for nothing more than a single month's shelter. In that month you gave me back everything I believed grief had taken from me forever: warmth, purpose, and a reason to hope for a future I had long since stopped imagining. Will you marry me, and make this house, and my life, whole again, permanently?" Clara's tears finally spilled over, though her smile shone brighter than the fading sunset around them. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with overwhelming joy. "Yes, Sebastian, of course I will." Sebastian rose quickly, slipping the ring gently onto her finger, before pulling her into an embrace that spoke of relief, joy, and profound gratitude for the unlikely path that had brought them together. Behind them, hidden discreetly among the garden hedges, the household staff who had gathered to witness the moment broke into quiet, joyful applause, Mrs. Bennet dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron, while Margaret beamed with unrestrained happiness. News of the engagement spread quickly through the estate and beyond, met with genuine celebration from tenants and staff alike who had watched the transformation of both the manor and its master over the preceding months. Even Lord Whitmore, upon hearing the news, sent a warm letter of congratulations, remarking that Sebastian's father would have been overjoyed to see his son find such genuine happiness after so much sorrow. The wedding itself took place the following spring, in the very garden Clara had first restored with her own hands, surrounded by blooming roses and the quiet, steady community of staff and neighbors who had witnessed the couple's journey from wary strangers to devoted partners. Clara wore a simple, elegant gown, and Sebastian stood waiting at the altar with an expression of open joy that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him only months earlier, before a desperate stranger's knock had changed the course of his entire life. And Sebastian, watching Clara tend the garden his mother had once loved so dearly, found himself agreeing wholeheartedly, grateful beyond measure for the storm that had once brought a desperate, determined stranger to his door, and the month that had changed absolutely everything he thought he understood about loss, healing, and the quiet, unexpected arrival of love. A year after the wedding, Ashcombe Manor looked nothing like the dust-covered, forgotten house Clara had first entered on that stormy night. The gardens bloomed with a variety of flowers she had carefully chosen and planted herself. The library stayed open every evening with fresh candles and warm firelight, and laughter, real laughter, echoed through corridors that had once known only silence and grief. But the peace they had built was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that had nothing to do with Gerald Pierce or family politics, and everything to do with the harvest season, and a crisis threatening the tenant farms that formed the backbone of the estate's income. Clara stood in the study one autumn morning, reviewing reports with Sebastian, her brow furrowed with concern. "The eastern fields have failed again," she said, pointing to figures on the page before them. 3 farms have lost most of their crop to blight this season. If we don't act quickly, several tenant families will struggle to survive the winter. Sebastian rubbed his temples, the weight of responsibility settling heavily across his shoulders. The estate's reserves are not what they once were, especially after the repairs to the West Wing and the resources spent rebuilding the gardens. "I don't know how much support we can offer without risking the estate's own stability." "Then we find another way," Clara said firmly, refusing to accept defeat before they had even fully explored their options. "What if we opened part of the manor's unused land for shared cultivation? The tenants could plant hardier crops on the estate's own grounds, land that has sat empty since your father's time, in exchange for a smaller share of the harvest going toward the estate rather than full rent this season." Sebastian considered this thoughtfully, recognizing the same resourceful determination that had first drawn him to her months earlier. It could work, though it would require careful management. And likely some resistance from those who believe such arrangements blur the traditional lines between landowner and tenant. "Since when have we cared much for tradition, when it stands in the way of doing what's right?" Clara asked, a small smile touching her lips despite the seriousness of their conversation. Sebastian laughed, the sound still occasionally surprising him with how easily it came now, compared to the guarded silence that had once defined his days. "Fair point. Let's call the tenant families together and present the idea. If they're willing, we'll begin preparations before the first frost." The following week, Sebastian and Clara met with the tenant families in the Great Hall, presenting their proposal with careful detail and genuine concern for the well-being of everyone involved. The response was overwhelmingly positive, tenants grateful for a landowner willing to adapt tradition in service of practical survival, rather than clinging to old customs at the expense of those who depended on the estate for their livelihood. Over the following months, the shared cultivation project took shape, transforming previously unused land into productive fields that provided a crucial safety net for the struggling farms. Clara worked alongside the tenant families as often as her other responsibilities allowed, her hands growing calloused once more with honest labor, though now undertaken by choice rather than desperate necessity. It was during this period that Clara discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled Ashcombe Manor with a fresh wave of joy after the challenges of the difficult harvest season. Sebastian's reaction, when she told him quietly one evening in the library where their earliest honest conversation had first taken place, was one of overwhelming happiness mixed with the same vulnerable wonder that had characterized so much of their journey together. "A child," he said softly, his hand resting gently against her still flat stomach, as though he could already sense the new life growing there. "After everything this house has lost, after everything I believed I would never have again, we're bringing new life into these halls." "A new generation to fill these rooms with laughter," Clara agreed, watching the emotion play across his familiar, beloved features. "Perhaps this child will grow up knowing only warmth and welcome within these walls, rather than the grief that shadowed your own childhood here." "Because of you," Sebastian said, pulling her gently into his arms. "Everything good that has happened to this house, to this family, exists because you refused to let a storm and a stranger's coldness turn you away that first night." The following spring brought the birth of their daughter, a healthy, bright-eyed girl they named Eleanor, after Sebastian's mother, whose garden Clara had first restored with such determination, months before their story had truly begun. Mrs. Bennet wept openly with joy at the birth, declaring that Ashcombe Manor had not celebrated new life in far too many years, and the entire household staff, along with the tenant families who had come to know and respect Clara through their shared work on the Harvest Project, gathered to welcome the newest member of the Ashcombe family with genuine, heartfelt celebration. As Eleanor grew, the manor continued to flourish, the shared cultivation project expanding to support even more tenant families, the gardens blooming more magnificently with each passing season, and the once cold, guarded Duke of Ashcombe Manor transforming steadily into a father who delighted in afternoon walks through the very gardens his own mother had once cherished, now filled with his daughter's delighted laughter. Word of Sebastian's innovative approach to supporting his tenants spread beyond the immediate estate, earning him respect and admiration among the wider peerage that had once questioned his judgment following Gerald's failed scheme. Lord Whitmore often remarked, during his regular visits to the manor, that Sebastian had become exactly the kind of leader his father would have been proud to see him grow into, compassionate, practical, and genuinely devoted to the well-being of everyone under his care. Gerald Pierce, meanwhile, faded quietly from relevance within the family circle, his reputation permanently damaged by the exposure of his scheme, his ambitions toward the title and estate abandoned entirely once it became clear that no amount of manipulation would succeed against a duke whose household stood united against him. Occasional reports reached Ashcombe Manor of his diminished standing among the broader peerage, though neither Sebastian nor Clara spent much time dwelling on his fate, too occupied with the genuine happiness they had built together to spare much thought for the man who had once threatened to tear it apart. On quiet evenings after Eleanor had been put to bed and the household had settled into peaceful rest, Sebastian and Clara often found themselves back in the garden where he had first proposed, watching the stars emerge over the fountain that had once stood choked with weeds and neglect. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Clara asked one such evening, resting her head against Sebastian's shoulder as they sat together on the stone bench overlooking the fountain. Standing at your door, soaked and desperate, certain you would turn me away?" "Often," Sebastian admitted, wrapping his arm more securely around her. "I think about how close I came to sending you back out into that storm, how different everything might have been if I had simply followed my first instinct rather than allowing my aunt's memory to soften my judgment for even a moment." "I'm grateful you didn't," Clara said softly. "As am I," Sebastian replied, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Every single day since, I have been grateful beyond words that a desperate stranger's plea for 1 month's shelter became the foundation for everything good that followed. This house, this family, this life we've built together, none of it would exist if you had walked away that night, or if I had turned you from my door." Clara smiled, watching the moonlight ripple across the restored fountain, thinking of everything that single stormy night had set into motion. The house that had once felt like a tomb now breathed with genuine life, filled with laughter, love, and the steady rhythm of a family, determined to honor both its past and its future. 1 month, she murmured, echoing the desperate plea that had begun their entire story. "I never imagined it would become forever." "Neither did I," Sebastian said quietly, "but I have never been more grateful for anything in my life." The following autumn brought the estate's harvest festival, a tradition Sebastian's father had once hosted every year, before grief had closed the manor's doors to celebration entirely. Clara had suggested reviving the custom, and Sebastian, eager to honor the memory of happier times while building new traditions of his own, had agreed without hesitation. The great hall filled with tenant families, household staff, and neighboring gentry alike, tables laden with the fruits of the season's successful harvest, made possible by the shared cultivation project Clara had championed the previous year. Music filled the halls that had once known only silence, and Eleanor, now old enough to toddle unsteadily between the tables, delighted the gathered guests with her bright laughter and curious exploration of the festivities. Mrs. Bennet, overseeing the kitchen staff with the same brisk efficiency she had shown since Clara's first morning in the house, paused amid the celebration to watch the hall filled with warmth and community. "I never thought I'd see this house so alive again," she said to Margaret, who stood beside her, equally moved by the scene before them. "It's because of her," Margaret said, nodding toward Clara, who stood laughing with several tenant families near the great hearth. Eleanor balanced on her hip. She never stopped believing this house could be more than what grief had made it. As the evening wore on, Sebastian found a quiet moment to pull Clara aside, away from the noise and celebration, to a small alcove overlooking the hall. He watched the gathered guests with quiet satisfaction, his arms settling comfortably around her waist. "My father would have loved this," he said softly, seeing the hall filled again, seeing the tenants and staff celebrating together as one community, rather than divided by fear or scarcity. "I think he would have loved you most of all," Clara said, leaning against him, "for finding the strength to rebuild what grief had broken, and for choosing compassion over bitterness when it would have been so much easier to remain closed off from the world." Sebastian pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, watching Eleanor giggle as one of the tenant children showed her a small wooden toy. "I could not have found that strength alone. You gave me the courage to open this house again. One room, one garden, one honest conversation at a time." Later that night, after the last of the guests had departed and Eleanor had finally been settled into peaceful sleep, Clara and Sebastian walked once more through the quiet halls of Ashcombe Manor, now filled with the lingering warmth of celebration, rather than the cold silence that had greeted Clara on her very first night within these walls. "Do you remember what you told me, that first night at the door?" Sebastian asked, pausing beside the library, its shelves still lined with the books they had dusted together so many months before. "I told you I had survived worse," Clara said, smiling at the memory, "though I never imagined survival would lead to a life filled with such genuine happiness." "Nor did I," Sebastian admitted. "I believed, when you first knocked on that door, that I was offering you nothing more than temporary shelter from a storm. I did not realize until much later that you were the one offering shelter to me from a storm of grief I had convinced myself would never truly pass." Clara reached up, gently touching his face, feeling the warmth and openness that had replaced the guarded coldness of their earliest days together. "We gave each other shelter," she said softly, "and somewhere along the way, that shelter became a home." Together, they remained in the quiet garden long into the evening, watching the stars above Ashcombe Manor, a house that had learned, through patience, honesty, and unexpected love, how to live again.